Well, a lot of you seem to have this question on your mind. What's Oregon's ceiling in 2023? We're answering that today. Here we go.
You are Locked On Ducks, your daily podcast on the Oregon Ducks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Yes, it is that time once again for Locked On Ducks. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view of the day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the Ducks. If you haven't already, please like, comment, subscribe, rate, review wherever you listen to or watch this show, which today is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/Locked On today to get started. So a number of you have this thought on your mind. What is Oregon's ceiling in 2023? Three of you actually asked some variation of this question. And I think to contextualize, just kind of the big picture argument with regards to, or debate, I think is a better way of putting it. Argument implies there's, nastiness in there, and we don't need to peddle in that sort of stuff. Is what did Oregon do last year? And do we feel like they are better this year? So a year ago, Oregon goes 10-3, Holiday Bowl victory, miss the Pac-12 championship game, start 0-1, win 8, lose 2 of 3, win the bowl game. That's how everything played out. Now, during that 8-game stretch, once things really got going, you beat BYU, who was ranked 12th at the time, that we knocked them off handily inside of Autzen Stadium. They were coming off a big win against Baylor. That helped our ranking significantly, kind of restabilized our vision in the eyes of the college football world after that bad first game against Georgia, which we don't need to go back down the rabbit hole and relive because we all remember it all too well. And then the wins started to pile up, and you had some wins that were convincing against bad teams, which was refreshing because didn't have that a whole lot the season prior. But hey, you look at the Stanford game, you're like, wow, it's 31-3 at the half. This is nice. Or you look at the Colorado game, the final score is 49-10. Like, boy, this is really nice to just be able to play the subs at the end, not worry about it, and just kind of, coast to victories the way that Oregon was capable of. That was an encouraging thing to see. And we kept winning game after. We can't forget the Washington State game. That could have derailed all that BYU momentum if we hadn't pulled a rabbit out of the hat up there in Pullman a season ago, 44-41, of course, the final score in a game that Oregon probably shouldn't have won. But so they kept things going, and suddenly they're at 8-1. And suddenly you looked at where Oregon stood nationally. And I was talking about this at the time extensively that, I'm not sure if Oregon is going to be a college football playoff team, but they were in the conversation, and they deserved to be in the conversation because they beat some good teams, because they won games in impressive fashion, because they looked like a team that was capable of maybe getting to the playoff. And so when you contextualize that with the question of what can Oregon achieve this year, that's got to be your starting point, right? I think with the way that the roster has been upgraded, that is kind of a baseline level of what I expect from the Ducks this year. Now, that's not necessarily what their ceiling is. We'll get to that eventually, but I think the baseline assumption here is through the first couple months of the season, you should see Oregon having a viable path to making the playoff. I was unfortunately correct, but I didn't think even during the run that we were going to be able to make the college football playoff. But I said, hey, I've been wrong before. Crazy things can happen. And if you just hold your own, you will get help. And Oregon did at one point in time control their own path to get into the playoff. They didn't execute down this final stretch of the season, of course, but that's where they were at. So I think about what I expect for this year and what they're capable of this year and say, okay, so you had a 9-3 team that was quite literally 2 plays away from being 11-1. I'm going to pause. I'm going to let that marinate for a little bit and think about if we get off the field, if Bennett Williams is able to swat that ball away or maybe even just make a tackle against Washington, and if we're able to punch it into the end zone, forget all of the defensive and special teams mishaps against Oregon State. If those 2 plays go a different way, Oregon's 11-1 in the Pac-12 championship game, playing for the right to go to the college football playoff against USC in what would have been a winner, probably gets a college football playoff berth at that point in time. That's how close they were. So that's something I fully expect Oregon to be able to do, especially with how their schedule begins, right? You have the Texas Tech game in there, but then the beginning of conference play is Colorado at home, Stanford on the road. Those should be a pair of victories there. And those should be pretty convincing victories. And then you have the bye, and then you have the Washington game. And that's what everybody's eyes are on. I want to double check that schedule real quick just to make sure I have things correct. But I think that's where I am going to end up predicting Oregon to be. We have Washington State at home after the Washington game. So, yeah, it's Portland State, Texas Tech, Hawaii, Colorado, Stanford. I think with what Oregon's done this offseason, the reputation they've got as a program, the season they had a year ago, if you start 5-0 the way Oregon is certainly capable of, they should be in the college football playoff conversation. So that's kind of where I start with the baseline there. All of this stems, by the way, from a trio of mailbag questions, which you can always be a part of. YouTube, hit me up on Twitter as well at smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks. YouTube comments are on Twitter with mentions and DMs, however you want. There were a couple of them here. One from Robin. So I feel like Oregon is going to have one of the best seasons they've had in years. Do you think I'm being way too optimistic? How about the number one offense in the pack and Pac-12 champs with a chance for the CFP? Riley's question. Hey, Spencer, big fan from Massachusetts. We are cross-country and international here at Locked On Ducks. I was curious what you think our ceiling is for this upcoming season. Obviously, we always want a national championship, which I think could be possible. What do you think we can realistically accomplish at our top end this season? And the last one from Gabe. I know it's hard to say right now, but honestly, how good do you think we will be next year? And do you see this team being able to close later down the season when we need those wins? And what would you say the ceiling is? So, big overarching question there, and I'll get to a couple of the individual tidbits that you guys all asked, and I appreciate the questions as always, but I would not say that I am in the mindset of, I think if everything goes right for Oregon, they're in the national championship conversation. Doesn't mean they can't get into the college football playoff conversation, but those are two different things. So think back to 2019 or 2021 or even 2022. All three of those teams, each of the last three full seasons of college football, Oregon has been at the end of the season, in the month of November, in the hunt for a college football playoff spot. Every single time. They were one stop on 3rd and 16 against Arizona State away from doing so in 2019, in retrospect. They were two horrible games against Utah away, and they were 2 plays away a season ago. So do I feel they're capable of achieving at that level where they are in the hunt, where they are looking at their schedule and what's left and saying, hey, if we win out or if we go 4-1 down the stretch or whatever, if they're undefeated in that time, we could be a playoff team? Yes, absolutely. But when I think about the national championship level, I can't say with confidence that they're there. Doesn't mean it's impossible for them to get there. But think about who won the national championship a year ago. You see where I'm going with this? That is where Oregon apparently has to get to, right? Either Oregon, which based on what we're seeing from Dan Lanning on the recruiting trail, which we're talking about more on tomorrow's show, they are capable of upping their recruiting game even more. Until that happens, or Georgia and Alabama or LSU and these really, really great SEC teams, until they, for whatever reason, pull back, take it down a notch, which I'll touch on in a sec, it's hard for me to say, yeah, I feel like if everything goes right, Oregon can win the national championship. Now, TCU was playing in the national championship game a year ago. Oregon could have a season like that. Everything goes right. You're a one-loss team. You got 12 or 13 wins. You get to the playoff. But doing that, having everything go your way in close games and, pulling out the hypno-toad and everything like that, I don't know what it would be for the Duck. We'd have to come up with something creative, and I'm sure we could collectively. But that is different than being able to win the national championship. But as is with individual races for this 14 playoff, help is often given to those who hold their own. Now, help is not automatically given to you at FanDuel, but you can help yourself out by giving some quality entertainment into your life by making a fast break to FanDuel during the NBA playoffs. Right now, new customers can get a no-sweat first bet up to $2,500 They're up in the amount here. That's $2,500 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't win. FanDuel's got great promotions every day. They've got Oregon's win total at 9.5. You could go over, you could go under, whatever tickles your fancy. They've got a safe, secure, super easy to use app with a great interface. You get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet all the playoff action or college football than America's #1 sportsbook, FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Get a no sweat first bet up to $2,500. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. Taking what is becoming our daily post first segment sip of water here on the show. So when I talk about other teams maybe needing to bring it down a notch, don't tell me that that's not possible. Do we remember LSU in 2019? You know what they are largely viewed as, and I share this viewpoint? The greatest college football team in the history of the sport. Yeah, that's what they were. They were the most dominant. They won it all. They have a quarterback who we now see is an absolute butt kicker in the NFL in Joe Burrow. They were that sort of team. And LSU has had to hire a new coach since then because it went off the rails. And they came out to UCLA and they lost. And then LSU said, yeah, we have a higher standard here. It's time to go. So at some level, would it help everybody, Oregon included, if Kirby Smart and Nick Saban retired at some point? Yes, of course. But even that isn't necessarily what has to happen for a national championship window to open, for somebody else to break through and knock off these SEC powers. Sometimes they can pull a Pac-12. They cannibalize themselves. They eat their own, and they don't get into that upper echelon, and it creates a window for somebody else to find the right matchup. Because it can always come down to, in college football, the right or wrong matchup. Ohio State very nearly beat Georgia in 2022. Oregon did not very nearly beat Georgia in 2022. Ohio State, however, lost to Oregon in 2021. Was that 2022 team that different from 2021? I'm sure they were better. But sometimes it's just about matchups and stuff going your way and having the right players and having the right team and having the right season, that it factor. All of that has to come to fruition if Oregon's going to be at that level. So getting back to the original question here that I got a little sidetracked from, per our usual arrangement, of course, everydayers understand that sort of stuff. That's kind of how I roll. What's Oregon's ceiling this year? I think it's making the college football playoff, and depending on the matchup, getting to the national championship game. Do I feel confident they could win it? No, not at all. Because I look at what those other teams have in the Georgias and Alabamas of the world. Georgia's got a weak schedule, by the way. I mean, Charmin soft, okay? It's, by SEC standards, about as weak as it could possibly be. They're probably going to go undefeated this year if they have competent quarterback play. But when I look at what those teams at the top have achieved, Oregon is not miles and miles behind. I know the Georgia game made it look that way, but they're really not miles and miles behind. And I feel like Oregon's roster overall is better than it was a season ago, particularly along the defensive line, which is something that we know was a big weakness a season ago. So I think Oregon's closer than most, but I don't think they're there yet. I think they're building in the correct way. I think they're bringing in the sorts of players who can help you get to that sort of level. But if you're talking about what Oregon's ceiling is this year, it's being a one-loss team. I don't think they've got undefeated in them, but I think they could be at their best, a one-loss team, a Pac-12 champion, a college football playoff team, and if they get the right matchup, go to the national championship game. That will depend on how much better the defense is able to be, particularly with the front four, than a season ago. Linebackers, and I mean, everybody's got to do well, of course, but I think you got to have an imposing front four in order to get there. And I think it also highly depends on the offensive line play and how well they can transition from losing Alex Forsyth, Ryan Walk, TJ Bass, and Big Sala. So that's a lot of production there. Those are the two biggest questions that I have. And I think if Oregon answers them in a resounding, positive, affirmative way in 2023, then yeah, we could see them hit that ceiling. But before we talk about, getting into the playoff and the national championship game and everything like that, you have to kind of take the airplane safety message approach. Before assisting others, adjudicate your own oxygen mask. Before worrying about the playoff, let's win the Pac 12 because in 2023, that's going to be no easy feat. You've got 6 teams, more than any other conference, with an over under win total of 8.5 or higher. Now, nobody's in double figures, so the Pac 12 probably ends up cannibalizing itself as usual and missing out on the 14 playoff. But I think that's a way for Oregon to look back and say, this was a successful season. This was a great season. It's a foundational season, and it's evident of a lot of really, really good things if they were able to win the Pac 12 with 2 or fewer losses. I think that would be a really, really attainable, tough, but attainable goal for the Ducks this season. So going back to Robin's question this year, could we have the number one offense in the pack and be Pac-12 champs with a chance for the college football playoff? Yeah, you're gonna have to win a big time road game, right? Between Washington, Utah, and Texas Tech. Those are probably the toughest road games on your schedule. I don't think there's another one that really even comes close to those 3. You're going to have to win at least 2. And then when you toss in the USC game, you got to win 3 of those games. Like if you're going to get into the playoff, we know you can have 1 loss. You don't have to be undefeated, even in the lowly Pac 12, which is going to have a wildly entertaining, exciting season. You don't have to be undefeated, but you can't have more than 1 loss in the Pac 12. So between Utah, Washington, USC, Oregon State's in there as well. We have them at home, so I feel much better about that. And we'll be out for revenge in a big, big way. And Texas Tech, you can lose 1 of those games. And that's not an easy thing to do, even for a good football team. You got to stay healthy. You might need a bounce of ball game where something just kind of goes your way, a call goes your way, or a random tip or anything, right? There's so many factors that go into whether or not you win a football game, especially ones that are going to be as highly contested as I expect all of those matchups to be. So, yes, a national championship is Oregon's goal as a program. Could they reach that game? That would be like their uppermost ceiling for this year. I don't see them as being in a position to potentially win it, given the powers that be at college football. Doesn't mean there isn't still a lot to play for. Doesn't mean a college football playoff berth wouldn't be worthwhile, because of course it would. You never know what happens in those situations, right? Maybe you get in there, you get a good matchup, and then if you end up winning that game and going to the national championship like we did in the first iteration of the 14 playoff, maybe somebody goes down. Maybe they have Cardell Jones as their 3rd string quarterback. Hopefully not in that situation if it were to come to pass. But, with regards to what the ceiling is and how many games can Oregon win, that depends on how many postseason games they end up playing, whether it's 1 or 2, right? They'll certainly be in a bowl game of sorts. That's I don't think in doubt in any significant way. But each of Oregon's last 3 full college football seasons, we have been in the playoff hunt for large chunks of the season. Fully expect that to be the case again. We have had 10 or more wins in each of the last 3 seasons. By the time the year came to a close, I expect that to be the case again. I think the biggest goal for Oregon this year, get back to the Pac-12 championship game, win the conference, right? You win the conference with this league, with how deep it is, you make a heck of a statement as a program. Dan Lanning makes a heck of a statement as a head coach. And I think a lot of young, promising players who are going to be part of this core, going forward as Oregon looks to build to that national championship season someday, we all hope. That is what we're going to be looking for is, you want to have games that can thrill you, that can excite you, that can put you in that conversation. But at the end of the day, I think that's where Oregon's ceiling is get into that game, matchup dependent and such. But, I'm not thinking too hard about that. I'm focused on how can we win the Pac-12? Because you're trying to here's another reason about as to why you got to focus on winning the Pac-12 first. Sorry, I need another sip of water there. Let's presume that the league stays together with whatever media rights deal comes and it's 5 to 6 years or something like that. Oregon is already by far the best recruiting brand out west when you remove USC from the conversation. if you are a Pac-12 champion going into that potentially new conference with San Diego State and SMU, if that's what, the conference ends up doing, to stay at 12 teams and have the necessary amount of inventory the way every other power conference does in the United States, then that is kind of emboldening your position as the team to be at, as the team to be, as the team that everybody wants to either be a part of or take down and circle on their calendar. And I think that's a position, mirroring kind of what Clemson was in the ACC. That's what Oregon's going to try to become here in what will, in all likelihood, be the new Pac-12. That's where I see them going, and that's kind of the path to the championship. Is you have to be the new Clemson. And by the way, Clemson in the ACC. Do you know when Dabo Swinney was hired at Clemson? 2009. Interim coach in 2008, made the head coach in 2009, didn't win a national championship until the 2016-17 season. It takes a minute. It takes a build. It takes a process. It takes a village and a community as well. And Oregon is well positioned to do that. With Dan Lanning being a young and really promising head coach and recruiter, yeah, that potential is absolutely there. But for this particular season, I don't know if the stars align in that way. Hope they do. Absolutely hope they do. But I'm not, setting the bar right there. So great question/questions, Robin, Riley, and Gabe. And one other thing, Robin, can we have the number one offense in the pack? Absolutely. You got all the weapons you need. That's going to come down to two things: Will Stein and the offensive line. Nice little rhyme there to round out this responding to mailbag questions here. So I think that's just about everything on that particular front. Not all for today's show because we're jam-packed as always. But if you want to be a part of the mailbag, you hit me up in the YouTube comments or on Twitter at smalls_55 or at Locked On Ducks. DMs and mentions are wide open. This from Sam. Spence, I apologize if you already talked about this. I didn't, by the way. But I would love to see what you would think are some new wrinkles and things you would like to see in the 14J package. Would love to see a breakdown. So I loved this package a year ago. Short yardage, goal line. I know it failed us in the Oregon State game, unfortunately. We got a little predictable there. Lanning even admitted as much. And red zone play calling wasn't exactly Kenny Dillingham's strength. I think it's the biggest area that Stein can grow from Dillingham's offense to his own is success in the red zone, because that cost Oregon several times a year ago. Could have cost them more if they'd been playing better opponents, like in the Stanford game, for instance. But anyway, so I think in that 14J package, what I love to see is the creativity that already exists within it. If Lanning goes back to Stein and says, hey, we had this package that was really effective, and we want to continue rolling that out as we did a season ago, I think having Jordan James and Dante Dowdell in there could be a real threat, because what you then present is what we saw kind of briefly in the Colorado game is the ability to hand it to the up man. And that could be Dowdell or James, because they're that big body, downhill, one-cut physical running type. So I think that you could put both them in the backfield and, have some interesting options after that, whether it's a fullback dive and pitch, or any kind of toss sweep with one of them being the lead blocker. I like the prospect of those two being goal line oriented backs. Now, what I do wonder about is how much they'll be able to use this given the personnel they have compared to a year ago. You went legit 4 deep at tight end a season ago. You had T. Ferg, you had Matavao, you had Cam McCormick, you had Patrick Herbert. Okay, those were all either 4-star recruits or 4-star caliber players. We don't really know what Caden Ludwig and Casey Kelly can bring to that situation. And Kelly's an interesting piece too, because he was a quarterback. So he's got, I think, a little bit more. He was a dual threat. So he's got a little bit more of that athleticism in him. Could use him in what I saw. What was it? Arizona game. The Arizona game, we ran a tight end sweep to Matavao, and it was perfect. And those sorts of wrinkles and the inability for Dillingham to use them against Oregon State, I think proved costly. I think you need to incorporate them a bit more when you're in the red zone. Obviously, the fundamental play is power left, power right, and doing that quick pin and pull with the guard, where your guard and tack, you put an extra offensive lineman, and you've got 3 or 4 tight ends on the field. And, Connerly was the extra offensive lineman a year ago. That could be any number of guys this season, because Connerly's probably your starting left tackle. But it could be Feope Laulu. It could be Dave Iuli. It could be George Silva, the JUCO transfer. A lot of different guys could be the extra offensive lineman in that package. But with the tight ends that they've got, I think their ability to use it as often and as successfully as they did a year ago will depend on how they feel about those guys, right? Because Varkey's Gums was clearly one of the guys they were after. They didn't end up getting him. They offered Seydou Traore from Colorado. They didn't end up getting him. So not that they're unhappy with the guys they did end up getting. They wouldn't have offered him if they didn't feel like they could fit. But did they seem like the top options at tight end? Probably not. So do they see that as, we can't use this package as much, and Sadiq isn't as much of a blocker. He's closer to a wide receiver than a tight end. What do they have in that particular package? I don't know. It's why I think the incorporation of Dowdell and or James as a lead blocker in there, and then put Herbert and T-Ferg as your 2 tight ends, and then bring in your extra offensive lineman. I think that could be, from a personnel standpoint, where they go with that, but we'll see how it plays out. From a wrinkle standpoint, it was an interesting formation a year ago. They ran in the middle of the field a couple of times, some 1 or 2 man routes, because they know the defense is getting up to the line of scrimmage and selling out on the run and everything. But I would be interested to see if they could introduce concepts that have 3 or 4 man routes, right? Like those traditional goal line offense plays that you run in NCAA football, or some of you weirdos out there who play Madden, which is a vastly inferior game. But everything we saw last year from a passing standpoint in the red zone was a 1-man route. Like the Cam McCormick touchdown against Washington State. It was a 1-man route, right? And you're banking on the defense selling out for the run, which they did, and that creates the one guy to be wide open. But I think adding some clever mixes with regards to running a fullback in the flat, a play action boot and a throwback, I think you could incorporate really easily. Because if you go offensive line heavy on the left side and you're strong to the right with 2 tight ends, I think you go play action boot right, and then have a tight end pretend to cut block. He intentionally whiffs and then releases to the far side. I've seen some college football teams run that sort of stuff, and I think it's really good. But doing that while also having 2 or 3 passing options to the strong side of the play, I think is a sort of wrinkle that I'd love to see him implement. I would have loved to have seen them call any passing play during that sequence down in the red zone against Oregon State. But, fundamentally, you got to put your best blockers on the field, and you got to be able to, just kind of out muscle the guys on the other side. That's what made that formation effective. And Jordan James was really good in it. I think Dowdell could be a part of it in year 1. But great question. I love that formation. And I think that Oregon, I would fully expect to see it at some point again next year. I mean, we ran at short yardage and by the way, the quarterback sneak was a part of that as well, because you can get up there and push Bo Nix across the line to gain. I think all that sort of stuff adds plenty of value there. Last thing here, this from Bud, regular question asker and everydayer here on the pod. Similar to your recent tiering of Pac-12 teams to Star Wars characters, that was something I did on my Locked On Pac-12 show a while back. Which Star Wars characters would you assign to each of the Power 5 conferences? I thought about this longer than most people would. Here's what we landed on. We'll do the Pac-12 last. The SEC is Anakin Skywalker, because he's someone you should be rooting against, but you can't help but watch and enjoy the whole darn thing. I should hate the SEC because they've got the players, they've got the money, they've got the championships, but I end up watching their program, every single weekend, because it is the best conference and they do have most of the best players out there. I want Oregon to make a dent in that as much as they can, but I think the SEC is Anakin there. The Big Ten, this is going to be a niche reference. My guy Peyton out there is going to love this sort of stuff. The Big Ten is Barriss from the Clone Wars. So the Big Ten formed an alliance with the ACC and Pac-12 with regards to scheduling, coordination, and all this sort of stuff right before they took USC and UCLA from the conference and put the Pac-12's future in absolute limbo. Barriss betrayed Ahsoka. And there's this powerful line in that, that storyline, which is fantastic in the Clone Wars, the animated series, by the way, where Ahsoka says, or where Anakin says to Barriss, Ahsoka trusted you. Well, guess what, Big Ten? We trusted you, and we were wrong for our efforts. So they're Barriss. ACC, with kind of the turmoil that's going on there and the unpredictability of where schools are going to go, are they going to act as one big glob of schools? Are they going to be individual units? We don't really know, right? Like, whose side is the ACC on right now? Are they pro go to the Big Two conferences, or are they with us here in the Big 12 and the Pac-12? We don't really know, which makes them Hondo, the pirate from the Clone Wars, who at any point in time can be on your side or on the other side. I think that is my best analogy here of the bunch. The Big 12, they are the Ewoks, because much like TCU, they can kind of catch you off guard. But compared to the big time players and the powers that be, they are actually overmatched. I'll leave that one out there for people who listen to Locked On Ducks and Locked On Pac-12. The Pac-12, meanwhile, I thought of as Kit Fisto, because Kit Fisto is actually really cool, even though if you just watch the prequel movies, he looks lame and he doesn't do very much. But then if you watch the Clone Wars series and you really study him, you realize he's really freaking cool. Now, not as many people know about him. Not as many people watch the Pac-12. He deserves a better reputation, just like the Pac-12. He had the opportunity to get one. USC and UCLA resurgence. Kit Fisto in episode 3 fighting Palpatine, but then it ends up being a dud. Kit Fisto dies in the lamest way possible for a Jedi Master. It's one of the biggest flaws in Revenge of the Sith. And then the Pac-12 has USC and UCLA depart. So Pac-12, Kit Fisto. Big 12, Ewoks. Big 10, Barriss. ACC, Hondo. SEC, Anakin. I love the questions. Keep them coming. YouTube or Twitter. Appreciate everyone listening. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and go Ducks.